Before we get to today's deep dive, please remember to subscribe, like, and share this video. It really does help us reach a wider audience. Now, without further ado, let's begin. Take a look around you. Your mobile phone, your television, your laptop, the clothes you're wearing, the medicines in your cupboard, the batteries powering your devices, the solar panels appearing on rooftops around the world, the electric vehicles becoming increasingly common on our roads. At first glance, they don't seem to have much in common. But look a little closer, and you'll discover that many of them are connected by one country, China. For decades, that connection seemed like little more than a story about cheap manufacturing, a place where Western companies move factories to reduce costs. A country capable of producing goods more cheaply than almost anyone else. But today, that story has become something far bigger. China is no longer simply manufacturing products. It is building ports, financing railways, leading in electric vehicle production, dominating the processing of many critical minerals, investing heavily in artificial intelligence, expanding its influence across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and parts of Europe. While many governments continue focusing on military competition, China has spent decades strengthening something arguably just as powerful, its economic influence. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What if the biggest shift in global power didn't happen on a battlefield, but inside factories, container ports, research laboratories, and global supply chains? What if the balance of power has been quietly changing for years, and most of us simply didn't notice? Tonight, we're investigating one of the biggest geopolitical questions of the 21st century. Has China already won? To answer that, we need to go back to a time when almost nobody believed China would become an economic superpower. Today, China is the world's second largest economy by nominal gross domestic product, and one of the largest trading nations on Earth. It is the world's biggest exporter of manufactured goods, a leading producer of electric vehicles, batteries and solar technology, and an increasingly influential player in artificial intelligence and advanced manufacturing. But only a few decades ago, China looked very different. For much of the 20th century, it remained a relatively poor country recovering from civil war, political upheaval, and economic isolation. Its economy was centrally planned, private enterprise was heavily restricted, international trade remained limited, hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens still lived in rural poverty. Very few people looked at China during the 1970s and imagined it would one day challenge the economic dominance of the United States. Yet history often changes quietly before it changes dramatically. In 1978, following the death of Mao Zedong, a new leader began steering China in a very different direction. His name was Deng Xiaoping. Unlike many revolutionary leaders, Deng was less interested in ideology than in results. He famously argued that it did not matter whether a cat was black or white, provided it caught mice. It was a simple metaphor. What mattered was not political purity. What mattered was making China wealthier. His government began introducing reforms that would transform the country. Agricultural controls were relaxed. Private businesses gradually re-emerged. Foreign companies were encouraged to invest. Special economic zones were created along China's coastline, offering tax incentives and fewer restrictions to attract international manufacturers. Cities such as Shenzhen became vast economic experiments. Only a generation earlier, Shenzhen had been little more than a fishing town. Today, it is one of the world's leading technology centers, home to companies producing everything from telecommunications equipment to electric vehicles and consumer electronics. China had not become wealthy overnight. It had simply begun laying foundations that would eventually support one of the largest economic transformations in human history. But China did not build that transformation alone. In fact, the next chapter of this story begins thousands of miles away, because while China was opening its doors, Western companies were making decisions that would reshape the global economy forever. By the early 1980s, China was changing. Factories were opening. Foreign investment was increasing. New industrial cities were beginning to emerge. But none of that guaranteed success. China still needed customers. It still needed investment. It still needed companies willing to manufacture there. And that is where another story was unfolding. Not in Beijing, but in boardrooms across Europe, North America, Japan, and elsewhere. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, many multinational companies faced growing competition. Consumers wanted lower prices. Shareholders expected higher profits. Businesses searched for ways to manufacture products more efficiently. China offered something few countries could match: an enormous workforce, rapidly expanding infrastructure, competitive labor costs, and a government actively encouraging foreign investment. For many companies, the decision seemed obvious. Manufacturing gradually moved east. Factories that had once employed workers in Britain, the United States, Germany, France, and elsewhere were increasingly relocated to China. The products themselves did not change, the labels did. Made in China slowly became one of the most recognizable phrases in global trade. It happened gradually, then suddenly, by the turn of the century, China was no longer simply producing toys and textiles. It was manufacturing televisions, household appliances, computers, mobile phones, industrial machinery, consumer electronics, and countless other products destined for homes across the world. Then came one of the biggest milestones in modern economic history. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. For Beijing, it represented international recognition. For businesses, it created greater certainty. For consumers, it promised cheaper goods. And for the global economy, it accelerated one of the largest shifts in manufacturing ever witnessed. Imports from China increased dramatically. Supply chains became increasingly interconnected. Container ships crossed oceans carrying millions of products every year. Many consumers barely noticed. Prices remained low. Supermarket shelves stayed full. Companies reported strong profits. Globalization appeared to be working. Or at least, it appeared to be working for many people. But there was another side to the story. Communities that had depended upon manufacturing for generations began changing. Factories closed. Industrial employment declined in some regions. Entire local economies had to adapt. Some workers found new opportunities. Others struggled. Political debates around outsourcing, trade agreements, and globalization became increasingly intense. Supporters argued that moving production overseas reduced costs, lowered prices, and helped lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Critics argued that many developed countries had become dangerously dependent on overseas manufacturing while sacrificing domestic industries and skilled jobs. Both perspectives contain elements of truth. Globalization created enormous opportunities. It also created new vulnerabilities. Perhaps the biggest irony of all is that many of the governments now describing China as their greatest economic competitor spent decades encouraging the very system that helped China become one of the world's leading manufacturing powers. This wasn't simply China's story, it was the world's story. Businesses made commercial decisions, consumers embraced lower prices, governments supported freer trade, investors sought higher returns, and together, those decisions reshaped the global economy. By the time many people began asking whether China had become too important, the transformation had already taken place. The question was no longer whether China had become the world's factory. It clearly had. The more important question had become, what happens when the world's factory begins building far more than consumer goods? Because while many governments were still debating manufacturing, China had already begun investing in something much bigger, its future. For years, many people in the West viewed China in much the same way. It was where inexpensive products were made: toys, textiles, household goods, basic electronics. The assumption was simple. China could manufacture cheaply, but innovation would continue happening somewhere else. Silicon Valley would create the technology. Europe would build the engineering. Japan would produce the precision. China would simply assemble the final product. For a while, that assumption appeared to be true. But China had a very different plan. Rather than remaining the world's workshop forever, it wanted to become something much bigger. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Chinese government dramatically increased investment in education, scientific research, and advanced manufacturing. Universities expanded, engineering graduates entered the workforce in enormous numbers. Research and development spending rose year after year. Technology parks appeared across the country. Companies that had once specialized in assembling products for Western brands began designing products of their own. It wasn't an overnight transformation. It took decades. But gradually, China began climbing the value chain. Instead of producing products designed elsewhere, Chinese companies increasingly began designing, engineering, and manufacturing their own. Today, that transformation is impossible to ignore. China is now one of the world's largest producers of electric vehicles. It manufactures vast numbers of lithium-ion batteries. It dominates the production of solar panels. It has become a major player in telecommunications equipment. Its companies compete internationally in robotics, artificial intelligence, high-speed rail, and renewable energy technologies. Some industries that Western governments once assumed would remain their competitive advantage are now areas where China plays a leading role. This wasn't accidental. It was planned. Beijing identified industries it believed would shape the future economy: advanced manufacturing, artificial intelligence, green technology, biotechnology, semiconductors, quantum computing, electric mobility. Rather than waiting for markets alone to determine the outcome, the state actively encouraged investment, industrial development, and long-term planning. Supporters argue that this strategic approach helped lift hundreds of millions of people into better living standards while creating globally competitive industries. Critics argue that generous state support, industrial subsidies, and market interventions have sometimes created an uneven competitive environment for foreign companies. Both perspectives continue to shape international debate, but regardless of where people stand, one fact is difficult to dispute. China is no longer simply manufacturing products invented elsewhere. It is increasingly competing to define the technologies that will shape the coming decades. And perhaps nowhere is that transformation more visible than in the race for electric vehicles. Only a generation ago, few people would have imagined Chinese car manufacturers competing directly with long-established European, Japanese, and American brands. Today, Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers are expanding rapidly into markets across Asia, Latin America, Africa, and parts of Europe. Some offer advanced technology at highly competitive prices. Others have become global leaders in battery development. The same pattern can be seen in renewable energy. For years, many countries viewed solar panels as part of the transition to a cleaner future. What received far less attention was where most of those panels were actually being manufactured. Today, China accounts for a substantial share of global solar panel production and plays a leading role in battery manufacturing, processing, and supply chains associated with the energy transition. That matters because the economy of the future may not be built around oil alone. It will increasingly depend upon batteries, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, critical minerals, and advanced manufacturing, which raises another important question. If China is helping build the technologies of tomorrow, what happens when it also controls many of the materials needed to produce them? Because beneath smartphones, electric vehicles, wind turbines, military equipment, and artificial intelligence lies a less familiar story. One involving minerals that most people have never heard of, yet use almost every single day. And understanding those minerals may be the key to understanding whether China has merely become an economic superpower or whether it is quietly shaping the future of the global economy itself. Imagine trying to build a modern economy without batteries, without smartphones, without computers, without satellites, without electric vehicles, without advanced military equipment, without wind turbines, or without artificial intelligence. Today, none of those technologies are simply built from steel and plastic. They rely upon an extraordinary range of minerals and materials that most people have never heard of. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, gallium, germanium, and perhaps most famously, rare earth elements. Despite their name, rare earths are not always especially rare. The real challenge lies in extracting them economically, refining them, and turning them into materials that industry can actually use. That process is expensive, technically demanding, environmentally challenging, and for many years, countries around the world were happy for somebody else to do it. That somebody was China. Today, China plays a dominant role in the processing of many critical minerals used in modern technology. It is a leading producer and processor of rare earth elements and is responsible for a significant share of the world's refining capacity for materials used in batteries, permanent magnets, and advanced electronics. Those materials sit inside products that most people use every day. Your smartphone, your laptop, medical equipment, electric motors, wind turbines, military aircraft, missile guidance systems, advanced radar, artificial intelligence hardware, even the servers powering the internet. This is why the conversation has changed. 20 years ago, governments worried about who controlled oil. Today, many are asking a different question. Who controls the materials that will power the next industrial revolution? Because if oil shaped the 20th century, critical minerals may shape the 21st. And China recognized that long before many of its competitors. Rather than simply mining these materials, China invested heavily in processing them. That distinction is important. Mining creates raw materials. Processing transforms those materials into products manufacturers can actually use. In many cases, that is where the real strategic advantage lies. For years, many governments viewed these supply chains as simply another part of global trade. Then the COVID-19 pandemic arrived. Factories closed, shipping slowed, supply chains fractured, products became harder to obtain. Suddenly, countries realized how dependent they had become on manufacturing capacity located thousands of miles away. The pandemic exposed vulnerabilities that had existed for years but had largely gone unnoticed. Governments began asking uncomfortable questions. What happens if supply chains are disrupted? What happens if political tensions increase? What happens if access to critical materials is restricted? Those questions became more urgent as relations between China and several Western countries deteriorated. Export controls, trade restrictions, technology sanctions, tariffs, economic security had become one of the defining political issues of the 21st century. And nowhere was that more obvious than in the battle over semiconductors. Although China dominates many areas of manufacturing, one industry remains especially sensitive: advanced computer chips. These tiny pieces of silicon power almost everything: modern aircraft, medical scanners, artificial intelligence, military systems, financial markets, telecommunications, autonomous vehicles, even household appliances. Without advanced semiconductors, much of the modern economy simply stops functioning. Unlike many other industries, the world's most advanced chips are not dominated by China. Instead, much of the cutting-edge production is concentrated in Taiwan, a relatively small island, but one with enormous strategic importance. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, better known as TSMC, produces many of the world's most advanced chips. Companies such as Apple, Nvidia, AMD, and countless others rely on them. That has transformed Taiwan from simply a geopolitical flashpoint into one of the world's most important technological assets. The United States recognized that dependence. So did Europe. So did Japan. Governments began investing billions to encourage semiconductor manufacturing closer to home. Factories are now being built across the United States. Europe has launched its own semiconductor strategy. Japan is investing heavily. South Korea continues expanding production. Not because governments suddenly discovered an interest in chip manufacturing, but because they realized just how dangerous dependence could become. Yet even here, China is investing enormous sums to develop its own domestic semiconductor industry. Progress has been slower than in other sectors. Export controls have restricted access to some of the world's most advanced manufacturing equipment. But China continues investing heavily in research, manufacturing capability, and technological self-sufficiency, which raises another question. If the world's largest economies are all racing to secure the same technologies, is this simply competition, or are we already witnessing the early stages of a new technological Cold War? Because increasingly, the competition between China and the West is no longer just about trade. It's about who will define the technologies that shape the rest of this century. And nowhere is that competition accelerating faster than in artificial intelligence. If manufacturing defined China's rise during the late 20th century, artificial intelligence may define the next chapter of its story. Around the world, AI is transforming industries at extraordinary speed. It is helping scientists discover new medicines, supporting engineers designing more efficient aircraft, improving logistics, detecting fraud, writing software, analyzing enormous quantities of data, and increasingly, helping governments make decisions. Whoever leads this technological revolution may influence almost every major industry of the future. Healthcare, finance, manufacturing, defense, education, scientific research, transport, agriculture. Artificial intelligence is no longer simply another technology. It is rapidly becoming the technology that improves every other technology. For years, many assumed the United States had an almost unassailable lead. Companies such as OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, and Anthropic became household names. Silicon Valley appeared to dominate the conversation. But while much of the world's attention remained focused on America, China was quietly building an artificial intelligence ecosystem of its own. Companies such as Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei, SenseTime, and DeepSeek have invested heavily in AI research, large language models, cloud computing, robotics, and automation. China's universities now produce vast numbers of engineers and computer scientists every year. The country has invested billions into artificial intelligence research. Provincial governments compete to attract technology companies. Innovation clusters have emerged across cities such as Shenzhen, Beijing, Hangzhou, and Shanghai. Yet this isn't simply a story about who has the best software. Artificial intelligence depends upon something much more fundamental: computing power. The most advanced AI systems require enormous data centers containing thousands of specialized computer chips. Those chips require sophisticated manufacturing, reliable electricity, cooling systems, critical minerals, complex supply chains. Artificial intelligence may appear digital, but beneath the software lies an enormous physical infrastructure. Which brings us back to semiconductors. The United States has introduced export controls, limiting China's access to some of the world's most advanced AI chips and chip-making equipment. The objective is straightforward: slow China's technological progress in areas considered strategically important. China has responded by increasing investment in domestic semiconductor development, encouraging homegrown alternatives, and accelerating research into advanced computing technologies. Neither side is standing still, both are investing, both are innovating, both understand what is at stake, because this competition extends far beyond commercial success. Artificial intelligence is increasingly viewed as a matter of national security. Military planning, cybersecurity, space technology, intelligence gathering, autonomous systems, scientific discovery, future economic growth, all may be influenced by whoever develops the most capable AI systems, but here's where the story becomes particularly interesting. The competition isn't simply about inventing better artificial intelligence, it's about who can deploy it at scale. China's enormous manufacturing base allows AI to be integrated directly into factories, logistics networks, ports, and industrial systems. Smart manufacturing, automated warehouses, autonomous ports, predictive maintenance, intelligent transport systems. Artificial intelligence isn't just becoming another product. It's becoming part of the machinery that runs the economy itself. At the same time, the United States continues to lead in several critical areas of frontier AI research, advanced chip design, and software innovation. American companies remain among the world's most influential technology firms. Universities continue producing groundbreaking research. Investment remains enormous. This is not a race with a clear winner. At least, not yet. And perhaps that's the point. The competition itself is reshaping the global economy. Countries around the world are now investing in domestic AI capabilities. Governments are developing national AI strategies. Businesses are reorganizing entire industries around automation and machine learning. The question is no longer whether artificial intelligence will change the world. It already is. The real question is who will shape that future? Because if artificial intelligence becomes the defining technology of the 21st century, then the countries leading its development may also shape the balance of global power for decades to come. Which raises another uncomfortable question. If China has become the world's manufacturing powerhouse, if it leads in key areas of clean technology, if it dominates large parts of the critical minerals supply chain, and if it is investing heavily in the technologies of tomorrow, can the United States and its allies realistically slow that momentum? Or has the global balance already shifted too far to reverse? That is the question we need to answer next. If this documentary ended with China's rise, it would tell only half the story, because the rest of the world hasn't simply stood still. Governments have been watching these developments very closely, and over the past few years, something remarkable has happened. Countries that once championed globalization have begun talking about resilience, self-sufficiency, strategic independence, economic security. For decades, the dominant belief was that global trade made everyone stronger. If a product could be manufactured more cheaply somewhere else, it made economic sense to buy it there. Consumers benefited from lower prices. Businesses benefited from lower costs. Investors benefited from higher profits. It seemed like a system where everybody won, until cracks began to appear. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed just how fragile global supply chains had become. Factories closed, shipping slowed, critical goods became difficult to obtain. Governments suddenly discovered that they no longer produced many of the products they considered essential. Medical equipment, pharmaceutical ingredients, computer chips, industrial components, even basic consumer goods. The question was no longer simply, how cheaply can we manufacture? It became, what happens if we can't manufacture at all? Then came rising geopolitical tensions, trade disputes, technology restrictions, export controls, sanctions. Suddenly, economic interdependence no longer looked entirely comfortable. It looked like a strategic risk. The United States responded by introducing industrial policies designed to strengthen domestic manufacturing. The CHIPS and Science Act committed billions of dollars towards semiconductor production. The Inflation Reduction Act encouraged investment in clean energy technologies and domestic supply chains. Europe launched its own semiconductor strategy. Japan announced major investments in advanced manufacturing. India accelerated programs aimed at attracting electronics production. Countries once comfortable depending upon global supply chains were now trying to shorten them. The phrase friendshoring entered political vocabulary. Rather than manufacturing wherever costs were lowest, governments increasingly encouraged companies to manufacture within allied countries. Others spoke of reshoring, bringing production home, not because it was always cheaper, but because it was considered safer. The objective wasn't necessarily to replace China overnight. That would be almost impossible. Instead, the goal became reducing dependence, diversifying supply chains, building resilience, creating alternatives. But here lies one of the greatest challenges. Supply chains cannot simply be rebuilt with political speeches. They were created over decades. They involve thousands of suppliers, millions of workers, ports, railways, power stations, factories, research centers, universities, financial systems, entire industrial ecosystems. Moving one factory is difficult. Moving an entire industrial network is something else entirely. China's manufacturing strength isn't simply the result of lower wages. In many sectors, labor costs have risen significantly over the past 2 decades, yet companies remain. Why? Because manufacturing isn't only about wages, it's about ecosystems. Imagine building a smartphone. You don't just need one factory. You need suppliers producing screens, others manufacturing batteries, others assembling cameras, others producing semiconductors, others providing specialized machinery, logistics companies, ports, engineers, designers, testing facilities, universities training skilled workers. China spent decades building these ecosystems that is far more difficult to replicate than constructing a single factory. This is why many multinational companies are diversifying rather than leaving entirely. Some production is moving to Vietnam, India, Mexico, Indonesia, Malaysia, Eastern Europe. But China often remains a central part of the supply chain, not because companies necessarily want to remain dependent, because replacing decades of industrial development takes time and enormous investment. This is where the documentary reaches another important conclusion. The competition between China and the West is not simply about who produces more. It's about who can build the most resilient economic system. Can democratic economies maintain innovation while rebuilding manufacturing? Can China continue growing while dealing with demographic decline, rising debt, and an aging population? Neither question has a simple answer. And perhaps that's why predictions about the future should be treated with caution. Some analysts argue China's best years still lie ahead. Others believe its economic model now faces structural challenges that will slow future growth. Both arguments deserve serious consideration. Which brings us back to the question we asked at the very beginning. Has China already won? Or are we only watching the opening chapters of a much longer contest? Because before we answer that, we need to define what winning actually means. And the answer may be very different from what most people expect. By this point, it's tempting to reach a simple conclusion. China manufactures more than almost anyone else. It dominates significant parts of the critical mineral supply chain. It has invested heavily in infrastructure. It has become a technological powerhouse. Its influence stretches across continents. Its economy has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So, has China already won? The answer depends entirely on what we mean by winning. If winning means becoming one of the world's most influential economic powers, then there is little doubt China has already achieved that. Its economy has transformed not only the lives of its own citizens, but the structure of global trade itself. Few countries in modern history have experienced such rapid industrialization. Few have reshaped global manufacturing on such a scale. And few have become so deeply integrated into the daily lives of billions of people around the world. But economic influence is only one measure of power. There are others: innovation, military capability, financial influence, political alliances, demographics, soft power. And here, the picture becomes considerably more complicated. China faces serious challenges of its own. Its population is aging. Birth rates have fallen dramatically. A shrinking working-age population creates long-term economic pressures. At the same time, the country faces significant debt challenges, particularly within parts of its property sector and local government finances. Economic growth, while still substantial by international standards, has slowed compared with the extraordinary expansion experienced during previous decades. Youth unemployment has become an important domestic concern. Consumer confidence has fluctuated. And many international businesses are now seeking to diversify supply chains rather than relying on a single country. China is not standing still, but neither is the rest of the world. The United States remains the world's largest economy by nominal output. It continues to lead in many areas of advanced software, aerospace, biotechnology, higher education, and frontier artificial intelligence research. Europe remains one of the world's largest economic blocs. India is emerging as a major manufacturing and technology center. Japan continues leading in advanced engineering. South Korea remains a global powerhouse in semiconductors, consumer electronics, and shipbuilding. The future is unlikely to belong to one country alone. It will almost certainly be shaped by competition, by cooperation, and by the choices governments make over the coming decades. Perhaps the biggest mistake is thinking this is a contest that can be measured like a football match. One winner, one loser. International economics rarely works like that. Power shifts gradually. Industries evolve. Technologies change. Countries adapt. The global economy is not static. It is constantly being rewritten. Which brings us back to the question we asked at the very beginning. Has China already won? Perhaps that is the wrong question. Because winning suggests the race has finished. The evidence suggests something different. The race is still very much underway. But China has ensured that it is no longer simply participating. It is setting the pace in industries that may define the future. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. For decades, many people viewed China as the place where the world's products were assembled. Today, it is increasingly becoming one of the places where the world's future is being built. Whether that future ultimately belongs to China or to a more competitive and balanced global economy will depend on decisions that governments, businesses, and societies make over the coming years. But one thing seems increasingly clear. The 21st century will not be defined by the same assumptions that shaped the 20th. Economic influence, technological leadership, industrial resilience, and control over critical supply chains may prove just as important as military strength, perhaps even more so. And if there is one lesson history teaches us, it is that the world's balance of power rarely changes overnight. It changes gradually until one day, everyone suddenly realizes the world has already changed. That brings us to the end of today's deep dive. China's rise didn't happen overnight. It was the result of decades of long-term planning, global investment, industrial expansion, and profound changes in the way the world traded, manufactured, and consumed. Whether China has already won is a question that history has not yet fully answered. But one thing is certain. The decisions being made today in boardrooms, laboratories, ports, factories, and government offices across the world will shape the global balance of power for decades to come. And understanding those decisions is essential if we want to understand the future. That completes today's deep dive. Remember to subscribe, like, and share this video if you found it informative. It really does help us reach a wider audience and support independent journalism. I'm Alexander Jones Redway. This has been the JR Voice, and I'll see you in the next one.